Today's guest is Lina Eriksson, professor in political science from the University of Gothenburg and the Department of Political Science. Her speech will be on changing social norms, what levers can we pull? And Lina Eriksson has published extensively on many topics within political theory and related disciplines. She is perhaps most famous for her contribution to the book Explaining Norms, together with Jeffrey Brennan, Robert Goodin, and Nicholas Southwood. And Bob is actually here today, which we're also happy for. So I will not say much more about you, Lina, but I will give the floor to you, and we look much forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. I'm really, really pleased to be here. This is going to be lovely. Thank you so much for inviting me. So the project that I'm going to talk about today is about how to change social norms. And it's a bit of a weird talk to give in any kind of academic context, because social norms is one of those topics that is widely discussed in all sorts of different fields. So I find when I talk about social norms that either half of the group in the room know absolutely nothing about social norms, and the other half know extensively about, they have lots of information, lots of knowledge about social norms, and very different perspectives on it. So I will start by apologizing to those of you who think that, yes, we know this, but you're coming at it from the wrong angle, Lina. And also to those who might not know anything about social norms and think that I should have explained some things more. If there's something that I'm saying that people don't understand, just wave and I can explain it during the talk. So the project that I'm talking about has a long history. It's not really my baby to begin with. I was living in Australia doing a postdoc with Bob here. And I was interested in social norms. I'd already talked about how I was interested in social norms, and Bob says, we have this project application, we have this research grant application in about social norms. And so it happened that I did another postdoc on social norms. And it was in this context that Bob, Jeff Brennan, Nick Southwood, and I wrote a book called Explaining Norms. As a result of that, I was invited to write a background paper for the World Bank's Development Report 2015. They were interested in social norms and how social norms affect economic development and various attempts to stimulate economic development across the world. And when I wrote this background paper, I was struck by one thing, that I could tell them about all of these ways in which norms could either support economic development or hinder economic development, but I had very little advice to give on how to change social norms, if and when you wanted to strengthen social norms that were helpful or undermine social norms that were in your way. And I realized that even though we have quite a lot of anecdotes and we have particular models for particular ways that the social norms can change, we don't know very much, at least not very systematically, much about how to deliberately change social norms. So that's what this project was about, that I started afterwards then. Trying to think more systematically about how can we deliberately change social norms. So social norms are everywhere. Those of you who work on social norms, you know this already. Those of you in the room who might not know about social norms, here's some examples to just give you an idea of what I'm talking about. When we get up in the morning and we get dressed for a work day, we dress in a way that's appropriate for a workplace like ours, for people like us. Nobody here turned up in the pajamas, for example. If you work in a bank, you might come dressed in a suit. If you work in a shop, you come in shorts and t-shirt. We then greet our colleagues in a way that's appropriate for people like us in a workplace like ours. And that will look different in different workplaces, right? And for different types of people. So we might shake hands, We might kiss each other's cheeks. We just go wave a little bit and say hi, good morning. So there are different understandings of how to greet people in different places, different types of workplaces, different age groups. We go to lunch with our colleagues, and there are norms telling us how to even hold our cutlery, right? And those norms look different in different places. If you chew with your mouth open, you chew with your mouth closed. If you have your fork in your left hand or your right hand. And when we go home, suppose you take the bus home, and there are norms governing how you even coordinate with other people getting on the bus. So in Sweden, for example, you typically line up in a queue if there's a lot of people waiting. So these are just examples of everyday social norms. But social norms govern almost all aspects of our everyday lives, and they can have profound consequences in a society. So some norms, I say a bit freely, some norms are good, some norms are bad. Just saying that is likely to get people going, right? But some norms are good, some norms are bad. With that, what I mean here is that norms can do certain things for us. They can serve certain functions for us. They typically in the literature, people talk about how they help us coordinate, how they help us solve cooperation problems, how they make our everyday interactions so much smoother just because we can predict what other people do, and we know what they expect us to do, and that makes life so much easier. Just imagine when you're invited to a dinner party, right? You show up with a bottle of wine or some flowers or some chocolate or something as a thank you for the invitation. Nobody brings a Shetland pony, right? And just knowing that nobody's going to bring a Shetland pony makes life so much easier. So norms do a lot of things for us. They help us know how to navigate social interactions that are fundamental for creating economic transactions, for knowing what to ask and what not to ask. They govern how we do things politically, how we treat each other in the kind of how we discuss political issues. They govern all sorts of aspects. Not all of them are sort of trivial everyday stuff like how you hold your cutlery, but they affect us in all sorts of ways. Like Ludwig here would know, norms of civility in the political political discussion, right? So norms can be good. They can do all sorts of good things for us, but they can also be not so good. They can be quite silly. They can be quite cumbersome, or they can be outright destructive. And these are the kinds of norms that the World Bank was then worried about. Right? So typical examples when people talk about destructive social norms would be things like female genital cutting, for example, or the burning of widows after their husband's death, or the social norms that can enable organized criminal gangs to keep quiet and not talk to the police. All sorts of these destructive social norms. The thing with social norms, when I say that social norms can be good or social norms can be bad, is that social norms don't, like when I talk about a good social norm, it doesn't generally benefit everybody equally in a society. There will be winners and losers of social norms, just that there will be winners and losers of all sorts of regulations in a society. So usually some benefit and others stand to lose from a particular social norm. They put the burdens differently on different people. So therefore, it's not necessarily the case that everybody in a society agrees on what social norms are good and what social norms are bad in a society. This is a politically contested question, just like all other sorts of rules and regulations that we create in a society. And I do not mean to imply, therefore, that there is a consensus about what social norms we should keep, what social norms strengthen, or what social norms we should undermine. But I'm interested in looking at how do we change the social norms that we have, because status quo is not neutral. We are already governed by a whole lot of social norms. So at least we can start thinking about how to have some sort of democratic control of all of these social norms that govern us in our everyday life. So we're all affected by these social norms. And what I've been doing in this project is that I've been trying to think about how can we construct a toolbox for how to deliberately change social norms. One of the things that's very well known in the literature is that social norms change, they evolve, they they change in all sorts of ways. We have particular models like the bandwagon effect, and we have this and we have that. But we also know that they're sticky in various ways. They're difficult to change deliberately, intentionally. They change, but not really as a result of our efforts to change them. So the question is, how do we deliberately change social norms? And obviously, people have been working on changing social norms intentionally and deliberately for a long time, and sometimes they succeed. But so I'm not saying that that is not happening. I'm just saying that we need to think broader about how to systematize a lot of the knowledge we have, and see if we can find new tools, if we can stimulate our thinking about finding new ways of doing this. Because we're not very good at changing social norms as of yet. So my idea for this project has been that if we think about how social norms work, we can then systematize our thinking about how can we deliberately try to change social norms by thinking about what kind of opportunities for changing social norms are associated with these different ways in which social norms work. Like, where do the opportunities open up for us to do something? I think of it as levers to pull. Like, where are the levers to pull to try to shake things around and change social norms in a particular direction? How many people in here are working on social norms? Few of you, yeah. So you will all have your own ideas about what social norms are, right? So I just wanted to tell you, for practical purposes today, I'm not that interested in nailing down the perfect definition, because there are different definitions in different fields of this, right? What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to think about typical characteristics of the phenomena of social norms. Because that's what's needed for thinking about where are the levers to pull for us to create change. And so I'm going to be this is not a perfect definition, but it gives you an idea of the kind of phenomena that we're talking about. So to do X, doing X is a social norm. If most people believe that most people do X, and most people believe that most people approve of people doing X. Once upon a time, social norms was often defined as behavioral regularity. Most people do this in a society. So that's a social norm of doing that. But that's not enough. Like, we do a lot of things in a society that is not a social norm. When it gets cold, I put on a thicker jacket. But that's not a social norm. That's just a behavioral regularity, because we're all getting cold. When the weather gets colder, we all put on a thicker jacket. So this is where the social approval comes in. A social norm is not just something that most people do. I will come to the most people believe in a moment. It's not just what most people do. It's also something that has a normative aspect to it. People approve of people doing this, and they disapprove of people not doing this. People are not going to care if I put on a thicker jacket or not, right? But they will care if I push if I push in front of a line in the checkout line in the supermarket, because there's a social norm that we line up in a queue and wait for our turn. So there's social norms have those two aspects to them. It's about what most people do, and it's about what most people approve of. And then comes the belief part here. You can play around with these and find all sorts of cases in which, it's not really about what most people actually do or what most people actually approve of or not approve of. What really matters here is that most people believe that most people do this and approve of this. And then for various reasons they do not want to, they conform, they change their behavior and they comply with the social norm, because they're afraid of sanctions if they don't. Many definitions then include also something like most people conditionally desire to comply with the norm conditionally on other people having these expectations or these preferences. People who are working on social norms, is there something right there that you want to add? Change or so? Okay, we'll continue then our sort of broad, vague discussion of the concept of, or the phenomena of social norms. So I've been thinking about how social norms work. And one of the typical things, obviously, that they do is they work because people have a tendency to want to do what they take most other people to do. And you can cash that out in different ways. Different fields are going to have different theories about what's going on in the mind of people when they do this. If it might be a preference for conformity, or it might be people drawing conclusions about the crowd having information that they don't. Or there are all sorts of different fields will have different theories about the psychology behind this. And the psychology behind it is not that important to me at the moment for these practical purposes. We can just say that people have a tendency to align their behavior with what they take the most other people are doing. Similarly, people have a tendency to align their behavior with what they take, with their perception of social approval. So that they tend to do what they take other people to approve of, and they tend to avoid doing things that believe other people disapprove of. They also work through peer sanctions. So there's something that upholds social norms. Usually we one of the major differences between a legal norm and a social norm is that legal norms have legal sanctions. Now, if you violate a legal rule, you can get fined, for example, or you can various sorts of legal formal sanctions against you for doing this. But social norms are upheld by peer sanctioning. So if I push ahead in the checkout queue, Ludwig here might tell me off. Or if I do something obnoxious like cutting my nails in the lunch tea room over here, or whatever that is. There, thank you. Right? There would be negative gossip about me. Like you guys will go, oh, did you see what Lina was doing? Oh, this is awful. There might even be social ostracism. Suddenly I'm no longer invited to any dinner parties. Nobody asks me to come around for lunch anymore. People are looking at me in a weird way. So these are sanctions, social sanctions from my peers, not from my boss, for example, and not from the police force, not from the courts, but these are peer sanctions. So far, these things are extremely well known in the social norms literature. I don't think that I'm saying anything new to anybody who's been working on social norms. But I want to add two things to this list that is sometimes discussed but not sort of necessarily in the same fields. One is that social norms associate symbolic meaning with behavior. They are not the only kind of phenomena that does this, but typically the behavior that social norms concern has a symbolic meaning. And that is one of the things that's going to be important then when we think about changing social norms. And finally, social norms are used for signaling, for strategic signaling between people. And that also, as I will argue, will open up for ways of changing social norms. So when I thought about what do I know about how social norms work, like what do they do? These 5 things were the things that came up on my list. They work through the tendency to conform to what most people are doing, a tendency to conform to what most people approve of, fear of sanctions or risk of sanctions, through the symbolic meaning, and through the signaling. So I figured I'm going to use these 5 to see if I can think more systematically about ways to change social norms. Like what buttons to push, what levers to pull in order to change things. So broadly speaking, the idea is that we can change people's beliefs about what most people do. If people have a tendency to do what most people do, and we change their beliefs about what most people do, then we have a chance of changing their behavior. We can change people's beliefs about what most people approve of. There's actually a vast literature on attempts to change people's beliefs about what most people do and what most people approve of. So those 2 parts of this are quite well researched as it is. We can change people's beliefs about sanctions. So about the risk that they will get sanctioned for certain types of behavior, the beliefs about the severity of those sanctions if and when they were to arise, and the legitimacy of sanctions. We can change the perception of the symbolic meaning. We can try to change the symbolic meaning. Sociology has for a long time had literature on the symbolic meaning and various struggles and fights over the right to define the social meaning of certain types of phenomena. So there's a lot for us to learn from. And finally, we can change the conditions for signaling. So in the rest of the talk, I'm going to try to give you some examples of each of these, how that works. This is part of a book manuscript. In the book manuscript, I have a chapter for each of these 5, where I try to go through a bit of what we already know and try to think about the possible levers to pull. But here I'm just going to give you sort of a taste of what I mean for each and one of these different 5 opportunities for social norm change. So the first one, change people's beliefs about what most people do. There's a lot of research on this. Typically, they start with something like American college kids binge drinking. And binge drinking is a problem. There seems to be a social norm to binge drink. How can we change this in order to make these kids drink less? And the idea then is, people tend to do what they believe most people do. If they are mistaken about what most people do, then we can change their behavior by correcting their beliefs. So normally, what they do, the levers that they use, so to speak, is that they have a survey. They make a survey where they ask these kids, how much do you drink? How much do you think other people drink? And they also tend to ask them about, what do you think about, is it a good thing to drink? Is it a bad thing to drink? And if they find that large groups of this target population are mistaken in their beliefs about what most people do, then they create a campaign that informs this target population about the actual drinking levels, thereby correcting their beliefs about what most people do. And so there's, as I said, there's lots and lots and lots and lots of research on this. The research is, at first it was seen as, yes, this is wonderful, we get really clear results, this is going really well. And then it turns out that actually it's a bit more complicated than that. There were studies that found no results, and they started to talk about a concept that a lot of people in particular from the sociological field are talking about in terms of social norms reference groups. It matters who we're talking about, who we are giving them information about. So in the book I try to provide a bit of an overview of what's going on with that literature and see what kind of lessons we can draw from it. But there are some possible problems that one should keep in mind. And I try to do this throughout the book, that I talk about the different, a bit about what do we know, and then what kind of levers to pull can we see from this. And then possible problems, things to worry about or be cautious about at least, if you're going to try to start pulling levers and pushing buttons. So one of those problems is, of course, well, what if people are right? Like, there are no mistaken beliefs. The kids think that most college kids are drinking heavily. And in fact, most college kids are drinking heavily. It would be disastrous to tell them this, because then you really reinforce the social norm about binge drinking, right? And you can't lie. Well, you can, but it would not be ethically. So then, in that case, you're a little bit in trouble. And what people typically find in this is that, college kids on U.S. campuses these are not an homogeneous group. So there are some that drink extremely little. There are some that are really heavy drinkers, and then there's a group in the middle who drink now and then. And so you need to think quite carefully about how your message is going to affect each and every one of those groups. Something that might have a positive effect for those who drink only occasionally might actually be a bad message to send to the people who drink very heavily. So you need to think about what group is it that I'm really targeting, like whose behavior is it that worries me as a policymaker. And that's associated with the idea of signaling information about others' behavior. So you need to keep in mind what kind of information. Am I telling people something that's going to reinforce patterns that I'm not particularly fond of? And then the last one here, I have a more extensive discussion in the book, but the last problem I want to talk about here is backlash by those who do less than others. And I'll keep that in mind while I get to the next slide, because I'm going to explain that more in that one. So another typical example in the literature about using information about what most people do to change people's behavior was certain electricity companies, when they send out the information to people about their electricity consumption, they included information about how your household is doing comparatively to other relevant households in the neighborhood. And obviously some households were found to be using a lot more electricity than comparative relevant households in the neighborhood, and so they decreased their consumption a bit. Right? Some households found out that they used a lot less electricity than their neighbors were doing, and they increased their consumption. So this is a famous boomerang effect that comes with telling people information about what most people do. You might be signaling things to certain groups, certain parts of this population that you don't really want to be signaling if your aim is, in this case, to decrease electricity consumption. So what could you do to avoid the boomerang effect? Well, here's what you can do. You can use the tendency for people to want social approval and avoid social disapproval. So they started adding emoji faces to the electricity bills. And those of you who work on social norms, that you know this probably, because it's one of those typical examples that is used a lot, but it is very illustrative, if that's the way to pronounce that word. So first they put a happy face on the electricity bills of those who didn't use a lot of electricity, and they put a frowning face on the electricity bills for those who used a lot of electricity. This had two effects. First of all, those people who got a smiley face, approval for using very little electricity, they did not increase their electricity. They, oh, look, I'm doing really well. I'm going to keep doing that. So you got rid of the boomerang effect. But the people who got a frowny face got really angry. So they started calling up the electricity company and complaining. And, they were really, I am not accepting this. This is, this is unacceptable, and remove this, and I'm not going to be censored by you. So the next time they did this, the electricity company, the research institute that were connected to it and was sort of organizing this, they very carefully avoided any frowning faces. So they now have only approval for the ones who are doing really well, and they don't comment on the people who are not doing very well. But the idea here, more generally, in this, is doing very much the same as I was talking about in the previous example. You use a survey to find out what people approve of and what people don't approve of a particular kind of phenomena that you're interested in. And then you have a campaign to inform people to correct mistaken beliefs. And usually you do this together with finding out what most people do. So in the case of the drinking college kids, normally these surveys go, how much do you drink? How often do you drink? How much do your friends drink? How much do you think that most college kids in this at this university, this college, drink? And what do you think about drinking? And what do you think that your friends think about drinking? And so on and so on. So you get that information. It's usually done together. Another thing that we find out then when you look at that literature is potential problems that, just as the frowning face was doing, they created a backlash against social disapproval. There are some of these attempts to change people's behavior, including the drinking college kids ones. When they push really heavily on the social disapproval information, there can be backlash from people going, how dare you express disapproval on me for this? In fact, there can be people start sort of getting, you reinforce subcultures of heavy drinking, because you create an identity because of that conflict and because of that expression of social disapproval. So it is, I would say, as I look through this literature and I try to see what levers there are to pull, there is reason to be a bit cautious about how you frame this and how you do it. There are cases where it works really well, and there are cases where it really doesn't work very well. Now, I used the case here of the electricity bills and the drinking college kids, but there's a vast range of various attempts to use this type of strategies for lots of different kinds of human behaviors. They're, getting teenagers to eat more fruit. Like, there's a lot of them in health behaviors, for example, where it turns out that what's really not going to help is telling them that their parents think that they should eat more fruit. But most of us who have kids already could have figured that one out. But these two fields, as I said, have already a lot of research on them. So what I've done here basically is go through go through and kind of get an overview of what's going on and try to think a bit more. Okay, so if I was, as I am, writing advice for somebody who's thinking about should I try to change people's behavior, try to change social norms by using something like this, what should I think about? The next things that I'm going to talk about are not as well researched. So here, there's more about me thinking about, okay, if I know this and this and this and this about how social norms work, what kind of opportunities can I identify theoretically? But I don't have as much empirical stuff to work with. First one is changing sanctions. And sanctions are quite well understood. There's a whole lot of stuff in behavioral economics about various experiments on sanctions and what will make people sanction and what will not make them sanction, and so on. And there are some like real world attempts to do this, but not as much as in the previous couple of examples done. what I find interesting here is that obviously sanctions deter from certain behaviors. We understand sanctions very, very well as a way of deterring people from doing certain things. But what's interesting here, I think, is that sanctions communicate norms. That's something that's not quite as well understood. So when somebody is sanctioned for violating a social norm, they are reminded of that norm. If they weren't aware of the norm, they know it now. So everybody who's been living in a different country than the one they grew up with have, I think, come across situations where they realize, oh, there was a social norm to do this that I wasn't aware of. So when you're sanctioned for violating a social norm, you either realize that there is a social norm that you were violating, or you are reminded of that social norm. It also affects you in other ways. It tells you that other people think this norm is important, because somebody is prepared to sanction you for it. It tells you things about what most people believe, that this is a widely shared, it's a not only does somebody else care enough to sanction you for it, but in the context that this usually takes place, it's also that person is obviously taking themselves to be representing the collective and have a certain legitimacy in sanctioning in that way. So it's not just a random person getting angry, but it's expressing a moral indignation, right, that you were violating this rule. So it also tells people a lot about what most other people do, what most other people approve of, the risk of being sanctioned, and so on. So there's a lot of information being given by the fact that you are sanctioned for violating a social norm. The levers to pull for a policymaker in relation to sanctioning are usually quite indirect, because you can put in place a legal sanction, a formal sanction, but that we're not really talking about social norms anymore. We're talking about the normal regulatory system of law enforcement and so on. But if you're going to use this if you're going to work through social norms, it will be peer sanctioning. So it's not really about the a sort of formal policymaker sanctioning people. But what you can do is you can change the perception people have of the risk of being sanctioned, and you can affect the severity of the sanction. And in fact, I think we do this as a society all the time in all sorts of ways. So policymakers, for example, they can make people more vulnerable to peer sanctions, and they can make them less vulnerable. The fact that we have I don't know the word for this in English. Arbetsförmedlingen. Thank you. The unemployment agency. Right? The fact that there is an agency, a state agency, that can help you find jobs, rather than you having to rely on mouth to mouth and your social networks, helps a lot, making people less vulnerable to social ostracism against social norms. The fact that that you can move to different cities. So the way to make somebody more vulnerable and more governed, more ruled by social norms, is by making them more dependent on the people close to them that might or might not sanction them for social norm violations. And the way to make them less vulnerable is to make sure that they have exit points. They have other ways of ensuring that they can live that is not dependent on these people. We also have rules against label, for example. Like you can't say what you can gossip in the group, in your friends group about somebody, but you're not allowed to just write anything on social media about particular people. That also decreases the vulnerability to social sanctioning. So we have in place a whole lot, I could go on, but this is just examples. We do have institutionalized a bunch of different ways in which we insulate people from the pressure from their peers. And we can do it the other way around. We can increase the vulnerability by making them more dependent on other people. Policymakers can also boost perceptions of legitimacy. If somebody says, if people want to change a social norm, and the only way they can do so as normal citizens is by violating a social norm, then you, as a policymaker, can go out publicly and say, we want this norm to change. This person is doing something great. Think about the Greta Thunberg case, right? Where part of what made her campaign successful was that there was a lot of publicly expressed approval of what she was doing, and not just here's a kid not refusing to go to school, but here's a kid doing something heroic in order to save the climate. There are also a lot of potential problems, of course. I discuss in particular perceived legitimacy problems in the book. So it matters who sanctions whom. And it matters a lot about perceived motives of the person who's doing the sanctioning. This is important also for legal sanctions. So, for example, if a police force gets to keep the money that they make from certain types of traffic fines, that can quite easily create the impression among people that look, they are waiting for you where they think that they're going to get the highest number of. They can write a lot of tickets because they make money this way. So you need to think about the perceived legitimacy of the person or the agency doing the sanctioning. Moving on to changing the symbolic meaning. So this, I think that most of us, we all know about the symbolic meaning of behaviors, but just as a typical textbook example, at the top here is a picture of a funeral. There's nothing wrong with having a nice red cocktail dress. But and in most cases, people will just give you compliments for a nice red cocktail dress, but not if you turn up to the funeral. Because if you wear a nice red cocktail dress to that funeral, it's going to have a symbolic meaning of glee, of disrespect, it carries a lot of social meaning that it doesn't have when you wear it to a cocktail party, right? So things don't have, behaviors have social meaning depending on the context, depending on the social norms that give them that social meaning in particular. So here's we have a social norm about wearing black to funerals as a way of expressing grief and expressing respect for the other people who grieve it, and so on. So we have all of these typical examples. There's nothing wrong with a red dress, except in this context where there's really strong social norm, because there it gets a different symbolic meaning than it does at the cocktail party, right? A very different kind of meaning. So behaviors mean one thing in one context and another thing in another context, depending on the social norms. The social norms are part of what imbues behavior with social meaning. And understanding how social norms are associated with symbolic meaning creates opportunities for policymakers to try to shift things around, provides opportunities for levers to pull. So one obvious one that's discussed in a lot of literature is framing and reframing, including what I call piggybacking, which is when you try to make people behave in a particular context, do something in a particular context by saying, look, this is a case of a norm that you accept in a different context. So you try to frame it as a case of this in that, and then piggybacking on the power of the social norm in that other context. You can create norm conflict. So some of the really nice examples given in the literature here is, they don't talk about it this way, but it's my interpretation of what's going on, is how to end the custom of dueling, how to end the social norm of dueling. Like, obviously, dueling is probably the most stupid way of resolving a conflict that you can imagine. So somebody comes up to me and says, Lina, you have ugly shoes. And I go, so I'm going to shoot you at dawn. No? Which doesn't prove anything about anything that we might actually have a conflict about. So what do they do? And the problem was here that people have, like, this was a male aristocracy kind of social norm. And it was not accepting a challenge to a duel was so associated with shame and lack of masculinity and all of those things that it was just not done. You couldn't do that and still survive. The social norm survive socially. So the social norm to accept a challenge to a duel was so strong that people did it, even though they understood what a terribly, terribly stupid thing this is, right? So how did they do? There are different accounts, and dueling has existed in different places. But one thing that is brought up in the historical literature on dueling is that you create a norm conflict. So, for example, in one place they said it is a duty of a of the male aristocracy to take their place in public office or in parliament or something. This is, definitely part of what it means to be, a male aristocrat. And then they said, but you're not allowed to. We have a rule now that says if you've been found out if you participated in a duel, you're forbidden from accepting public office. And that gave people some wiggle room, right? It made them say, I'm really sorry. I really wish that I could meet you at dawn for that duel. But I'm so sorry, but I can't because, family honor requires that I take up my position in public office and I have to honor this, so I have to do it. So you create norm conflict and they can say, I really wish I could meet you at dawn, right, but I can't, sorry, because I must honor my family and so on, and my position in society. Another one was for army officers. To say, well, if you are killed in a duel, then your widow and your children will not get any army pension. And they can say, as a responsible family father, I have to honor this, and I can't meet you at a duel. Looking at the clock, I'll skip this bit, and I'll still talk about. So there are potential problems with this as well. First of all, changing the symbolic meaning of behaviors creates winners and losers too, and you can get a backlash from those who are not materially affected by what you're doing, like their material interests aren't affected, but the narrative about their lives and about their life choices are changed by the things that you do. So a typical example is when women started entering the workforce, this didn't really affect materially the women who were housewives in the US, for example, but there was a strong backlash from a lot of housewives because suddenly it changed the meaning of being a housewife. Whether or not this was being able to bake a lot of cookies and have a clean house, and your children were always clean and was ready to accept guests and so on. That suddenly was devalued. That was no longer the meaning of female success. Right? And also, anyone who's trying to crowd in what I call, let's talk about the crowding in of social norms. So, crowding in and crowding out is a quite common phenomena. It's discussed in a lot of literature. A typical example of how you can crowd in or crowd out norms is when you use external incentives in a way that either makes people lose their motivation to comply with the social norms that they had, or increase it, depending on if you crowd out or crowd in. A school book example is childcare centers that were very annoyed by the fact that parents were picking up their kids late. So what they did was they sent out a letter saying, from now on there will be a cost associated with picking up your children late, hoping that this would make people go, oh no, well, I'm going to pick up the kids on time then. But what it turned out was now a lot more people started to pick up their kids late because they perceived this. Before, they had felt ashamed. They were violating a social norm about being late to pick up your child from the childcare. But now they felt that the childcare centers were just having for that. And they go, well, it's a fee, I can pay. And, if I pay, then I haven't done anything wrong. And so suddenly a lot of more stressed parents were just paying the fees and picking up their kids late. turns out that the trick to get this to work for the childcare center is to very deliberately frame it as a fine and say, we are not getting the costs back that it actually costs us to keep staff here late. Right? That's what you need to do. Also, you can try too hard to crowd in. No, we've all been to workplaces, I think, but they have the prize for the best employee. And suddenly everybody goes, this is ridiculous. The time, yes. So the final thing I want to talk about is how you can change signals or change the way social norms are used as signals. Let me quickly tell you what it means for social norms to be used as signals. If I go to the park and somebody's eating something and a lot of garbage associated with that, and they look me in the eyes like this, and then they drop it, and then they walk away. That is they not only do they violate the social norm of not littering, right? But they're doing so is sending me a signal. It's sending me a signal about how they perceive our power relationship and what kind of attitude they have to me and what kind of person they are. In particular, if this person has a lot of friends around that looks at them, watches them do this. When we comply with social norms, we send signals about what a reliable person we are, how we are socially well adjusted, how we can be trusted to behave appropriately in all sorts of situations. If we violate social norms, we send very strong signals about other things. What things more exactly depends on who is doing it to whom and in what context. So we use social norms to signal stuff. Charities know this very, very well. They talk about how they allow people to frame donations in a way that make their donations public, so that people can send signals to other people about how socially responsible and altruistic they are by making these donations. And if they provide people with the opportunity to signal in this way, then they will get much bigger donations. There's almost nothing about how to change levers to pull, right? How to change people's behavior through affecting signals. There's a little bit of very short stuff in some of the theoretical papers, but I think there's a lot we can do to affect this. We can change the audience, like how many people will be receiving your message when you try to signal. The labor laws are doing this, for example. We can make tax report information public. We can change receivers' beliefs about ratio types. So when we have we have inspections of car mechanic places and publish the information in newspapers, this tells people about how worried they have to be about being tricked when they take the car to the mechanic. And so suddenly the good reputation of the car mechanics start to matter much more. They need to start signaling to people in various ways that we are reliable, you can trust us, Whereas if people believe that all the car mechanic places are going to be trustworthy, then they don't have to engage in that kind of signaling. They don't have to try to tell you in credible ways that we will never trick you. You can change the cost of detecting or deterring imposters. So one of the things that so an imposter is somebody who tells you that they are a kind of person through what they do through social norms, but who actually are not. Right? They try to pretend that they are reliable, but they aren't. And we already do quite a lot of this. When we require certifications for certain types of jobs, this is one way of affecting what it would, the costs for people of detecting if somebody claims to have certain abilities and so on, but doesn't have that. And we can affect the cost difference between the two different alternatives in that way, making only those that actually are reliable, making it worthwhile only for those actually are reliable to engage in that kind of signaling behavior. It's now 5 to right. So the last bit here is that, so these are peer-to-peer signaling. Is this when people like us are signaling to each other about our own characteristics, our own personalities. But governments signal to citizens all the time too. And there's also a matter of knowing what kinds of signals to send and what kinds of signals not to send. So one of the things that governments do is they create social meaning through signaling. We think that this type of behavior should be understood in this particular way, and they signal that to the audience. They create social meaning for a certain type of behavior, and sometimes they signal information about other people's behavior that they don't actually intend to signal. Sometimes they intend it, but sometimes they don't intend it. And that's related to the final point there about potential problems. When you unintentionally send signals that you don't want to send. So typical example are when the newspapers are full of reports about people cheating on their taxes, you create not really the reaction that, oh, we should all be really honest in our tax reports, but rather than the impression, oh, everybody else is cheating on the tax reports. So, there's no point for me of being honest. So you need to think about what kind of message it is that you are sending. So to sum up here at the end, what I want to say about what I'm doing with the project is I think of it as trying to systematize our thinking about levers to pull, about directing my gaze into areas where where people aren't normally necessarily looking, and go, what can we think about? What kind of opportunities can we find here, given our way of understanding of how social norms work? Like, what can I identify here? And in that way, assembling a sort of a toolbox of various tools for creating social norm change. And it's not the case that any one of those particular tools is going to work at all times, right? It's extremely context dependent. Sometimes you might need several, sometimes nothing might work. There's no guarantee that you can do this. But I think that by collecting these tools, so to speak, in a toolbox, or in my case, partly guiding our gaze to look, here's an area where there might be tools, go look for them here. We are at least increasing our chances of being able to collectively, democratically, together think about what kind of social norms do we want. And I don't think this is going to be about whether you hold your fork in your left hand or your right hand, but about other types of norms that really affect power hierarchies in our society and the costs and burdens of various things. I know I really look forward to the any kind of advice or criticisms, or you've forgotten this or you misunderstood that, or any kinds of comments that you might have. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lina. Thank you for this very informative talk. We now open up the Q&A session, and with the help of Stina here next to me, we will collect questions both from you who are present here in the room and those online. And you will signal that you want to ask a question by raising your hand if you're in the room, or by using the chat function if you're online. Follow-ups are also, according to our norms, permissible, and you do that by raising a finger, or again doing that by pointing it out in the chat function. We're also trying to create a social norm here that you will introduce yourself and tell us your name and your discipline to help the discussion. So please do that if you can. Now, questions are collected here by Stina. And while she's doing that, I take, which is also, I think, consistent with our norms, the privilege of asking one small question to begin with. And there are many things here, of course, that we can pick on or discuss. But one particular interesting thing I found is the role of sanctions in norms, and to what extent they are. I mean, you say that norms are part of how social norms work. Sanctions are parts of what social norms work. It wasn't clear to me whether you think that sanctions are necessary for social norms to exist. or it's just a generalization that often social norms are associated with sanctions. And I was thinking there about the fact that social norms are typically internalizations of normative attitudes, as you say in the book. And if you think that is what norms require in order to be social norms, there wouldn't necessarily be a need for sanctioning, I guess. Insofar as people have actually internalized a certain normative attitude, well, why would there be sanctions? I mean, of course, we know that in many situations, people don't always, not everyone have internalized them, and sanctioning might be a sort of helpful way of keeping them up. But it doesn't seem that it's necessarily the case that you need sanctions. And also, this connects to what, in discussions in legal theory, there is this question whether sanctioning and coercion are necessarily part of a legal system, or whether it's just a fact that most legal systems actually provide coercion and sanctions, but it's not part of the idea of a legal system, which I think Ras would argue. I was just interested in that.
So that's a very good question. Sometimes sanctions are included in a definition of social norms, like the risk of sanctions, but usually they're not. When I say that they're part of how social norms work, the way I mean something like this. So we know that people internalize social norms, but we also know that different people internalize any given social norm to different extent. So there's going to be some people who really feel that it is wrong to push ahead in the line in this checkout queue in the supermarket. And we have people at the other end who go, no, that's not wrong. I don't care, but I'm going to avoid doing it if there are other people in that queue that's going to be really angry with me if I do it. Like, I want to avoid the sanctions. And then there are people in the middle that go, yeah, maybe. For most situations where social norms are involved, you have conflicting interests. So there are some self-interested reason to behave in a particular way, and there's a social norm saying to you, don't do that, because it's cumbersome, maybe. Like if I'm in the park and I've just eaten a chocolate bar and I have the wrapping left in my hand, the social norm requires me to keep that in my hand until I get to a garbage bin and put it in, right? It's not a huge cost to me, but there's a little bit of cost to it. So for a lot of people in the middle, whether or not they're going to go with their self-interest or whether they're going with a social norm depends a bit on the context, and depends a bit of other things. So the sanctioning kind of boosts them. It pushes people that were otherwise not going to comply with the social norm in the direction of complying with the social norm. There's still going to be the case. So there are some people who violate the social norm, and the people who are already had already internalized the norm fully and thought this is just morally required of me to do this. They aren't going to be affected by sanctions, but there are a whole lot of people in the middle for whom you kind of increase the chance that they're going to comply with the social norm. But also, I think there's another kind of connection between sanctions and social norms, and that is associated with the fact that social norms comes with a perception of general social approval for certain things. So the kind of sanctions we're talking about here could very well just be disapproval. And that is, that comes automatically. If it is the case that somebody approves of people putting their litter in the garbage bin rather than on the ground, then if the sanction is just the disapproval of somebody who drops it on the ground, that kind of stems directly from the fact that part of what social norms are about are perceptions of widely shared social disapproval or approval for certain types of behavior. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, but I guess one other way of putting it would be to say that sanctions are only needed when social norms are not universally accepted.
Yes.
So insofar as there was a social norm that was actually in force, then it wouldn't need any sanctions.
No,
At
but
least not if it's the approval norm.
Right, but I think that there is a sanction that will still be sort of latent, which is the disapproval if somebody were to violate the social norm, right?
Okay.
That one is always going to be there in the background
Yeah.
because of the nature of social norms being having that association to perceptions of social approval and disapproval.
Okay. Yes, thank you. So we have a couple of people on the list here, and we'll start with Marcus.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'm Marcus. I'm a political scientist. I was wondering about another way of possibly changing norms and whether it's, is it covered by the five categories, or is this another possibility perhaps? So you mentioned in passing the notion of reference groups. And I was wondering, isn't part of politics, the political process is partly about creating different kinds of reference groups within the electorate, for instance. So the workers' movement back in the day, they tried to create some kind of class consciousness, and within this identity, they also, by creating the identity, they also created a reference group for people in the workers' movement where there were certain norms. There was a large overlap with the movement not to drink alcohol, for instance. But so that created sort of the preconditions for social change or political developments that had large consequences. And I guess something similar is happening today with far-right populist parties, for instance, where there is the MAGA crowd in the US, for instance, which seem to take pride in not accepting the norms of the mainstream. Or rather, as you also mentioned in your talk, they take some kind of pride in actually rejecting those norms, and the more they are sort of disapproved of by the mainstream, the more they are being tied together as a group, and their convictions become even stronger. So, is this relevant for your project? Is this something that political entrepreneurs could pick up on and try to change social norms, not by any of the things that you mentioned now, but actually by artificially or organically trying to influence the kinds of reference groups that people identify with? Like, could a response to the MAGA crowd, could that be to make them sort of see the benefit of thinking of humanity as a whole, or the US as a whole as a political community? Yeah. So any thoughts on that would be interesting.
Right. So this is an excellent point. As you were talking, I was trying to go through in my mind. So what am I actually saying in this book, and what am I just agreeing with but not actually writing about? I don't think I've addressed it in quite the way that you talk about it, but I agree with you. So here's how I've addressed it. I talk about how you can reinforce certain types of subcultures and certain types of identities in various ways. In particular, when I talk about, so I didn't talk about it in the positive way that you were talking about, that you're trying to create it. And I'm more concerned, I think it's difficult. I'm more doubtful about how easy it is to deliberately create a social identity. Political mobilization is all about that. So there is a literature about how you can mobilize certain types of social identities and characteristics and make that into a powerful political movement and so on. What I've in the book been more worried about is when you inadvertently create subcultures or identity groups that you're not really interested in creating. In particular, in relation to when you express social disapproval. So one way in which we know that political groups are formed is when they perceive themselves as badly treated or badly thought of by others, right? And they try to, they kind of, their identity gets stronger, and they turn to each other much more, and they form their own social norms within that group as a way of preserving a sense of dignity in the face of disrespect from majority culture. And you can do that. Any kind of strategies that express social disapproval of a particular group is going to play into that, obviously. So you need to think. So I've talked more about it from that point of view. And when you create social subgroups that you don't actually want to create. But obviously there is the positive side of it, which I haven't talked about. So that's a really interesting. I'll think about what to include about that, because I do know, as obviously you do, that there is a literature about political mobilization in political science, and how you can use characteristics of certain groups to make that into politically salient characteristic, and thereby create agency for them as a group. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Katarina, next question.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was super interesting. So I have a little reflection about, you started the talk by saying that, proposing that we should think about maybe how we could maybe take more democratic control of like even everyday social norms, how we can like form our norms in a better way, like together democratically. And then you also ended on that note, and you included like tools that also policymakers might think of, and so I'm just kind of wondering a bit about this kind of bootstrapping problem that you also alluded to in the end, because I mean, if there are like policymakers who are considering using the tools that you present in your toolbox here, framing, for instance, or creating norm conflict and these kinds of things, then of course they will use these tools in order to change norms, and this will, as you said, create winners and losers. And then if we then consider that taking democratic control, if the policymakers take democratic control of these tools, that presupposes transparency from a democratic viewpoint, right? So from like a legitimacy viewpoint. So that transparency would then also include, of course, the purposes of these measures proposed, of the tools used. And then that goes back then to the question, so what kind of message are you sending? So it's kind of gets, of course, a bit tricky not to convey that we're doing this in order to manipulate you and change the norms in any kind of devious ways, because not everybody will be on board, of course. So it's just kind of an invitation for you to reflect a little bit on these problems that we create when we want to do this in a more kind of structured way than just leaving it to the kind of organic development of our social world.
Good. This is also a very good question. I think so. I hadn't quite. I mean, the kind of problem that you're talking about is very clear in the signaling literature. In fact, I've written another paper that's not on social norms, but about charity donations and how they, there's a certain upper limit to how much you can push the signaling thing before you start to undermine the whole point of it. So I can certainly see the problem. If you're saying, look, we're going to create a rule here that you can't take public office if you've been in a duel, then there's a certain risk that you can't, that people who are being challenged to a duel can't say with a kind of straight face, oh, I'm really sorry, I can't meet you at dawn because I have to. Right? But I think that often, we shouldn't exaggerate the extent to which we undermine the purpose through the transparency. So in the case of the dueling, I think it was very obvious to people that this is exactly what the authorities were trying to do. But the authorities, policymakers had, they still managed to change the incentive structure in such a way that, public office had always been a part of the social role of the male aristocracy. And so once they could threaten to cut you out from that if you didn't stop dueling, then that provides enough incentives for people to go, okay, well, I need to play along with their transparent attempt to stop dueling, because they threatening to cut me off from something that's really important to the role that I'm playing in society. And I think the same is true for many other of these as well. So they don't have to be done in a kind of manipulative way. particularly not when you're creating norm conflict. So take another one. So I've written a paper with a couple of other co-authors about the pressure to make new mothers breastfeed and the kind of social norm things going on in that. And one of the things we talk about is how not necessarily government agencies, but sort of with the backing of government agencies, other agencies are pushing social norms about exclusive breastfeeding for a long time very heavily on women in many countries, disregarding completely what this does to their work options and so on, right? And we talk about, so you can certainly have a democratic discussion about how important is it for people to breastfeed their babies in comparison to being able to keep a job? Or what are we as a society supposed to do if we want mothers to breastfeed their babies, but we also realize that people need to put food on the table for themselves and pay the rent, right? What options do we have here? Maybe we want to undermine that social norm until we've restructured society in such a way that people actually can combine breastfeeding their babies with keeping a job. So we can have a democratic discussion about the consequences of pushing one social norm message rather than do it some other way or having another social norm. And I don't think that and if you take the current message of it is really, really important that new mothers are breastfeeding their babies for exclusively for a long time, that social norm I don't think is undermined in any way by the transparency of the motive for that, which is to promote baby health, right? So the fact that there is baby health, that the authorities are worried about baby health and they think the breastfeeding is going to improve the health of the infants, doesn't undermine the message of the norm. Did I answer your?
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I'm totally on board. I mean, obviously it depends a lot on the context and also the type of the norm and how this change is coming about. So I'm totally on board with the deliberation part. That seems to be much easier. It's kind of social kind of deliberation within the society about what norms do we want to have, and we can kind of reason our way towards something better maybe, and then basically most people would be on board. With the kind of giving the task to the policymakers to use these tools to kind of engineer a better society, that seems to be a bit more tricky. And when you talk about this example, the dueling example, which is super interesting, of course there maybe the conditions were a bit more beneficial for the norm change because there was already there were not very many losers, right, from the norm change. And it was like a classic prisoner's dilemma. Everybody wanted to get out of it, and then somebody just kind of came up with this ingenious way of framing it, and then creating this norm conflict, and then everybody got out of it, and everybody was a winner. So that might be easier than other attempts to change norms, like institutionally or from a policymaker side, where there are winners and losers, and where some people might feel manipulated, and where that might undermine the whole attempt. So, yeah.
That is a very, very good point. I feel my mind is racing out, trace out all the implications of as many norms as I can, like as many cases as I can think of. I thank you very much for this, and I think I need to include something on this in the book. Thank you.
Was there a finger here from Per? Yes.
So Per Kraulus is my name, and I'm a writer working on a book on evolution and politics. There's one impression I got immediately looking at your abstract, and that it has a certain top-down perspective, toolbox. You envision a social engineer manipulating the masses. So what I think your analysis is very interesting, very appropriate, but I think there's a variable missing here, and that is who is trying to do what to whom. So in every instance here, you need to specify, because that is also a signal. So if some particular agency, some particular group of people, some particular set of people are trying to change a social norm that affects some other group, then immediately that fact is using power, and that's a signal. So that has to be included in this kind of analysis, I believe. And also there are some cases where social norms change without anyone really wanting it to, and that's interesting too, but of course can't really be used as a toolbox. But I think the question of who tries to do what to whom is central and needs to be factored in at every step here in the analysis.
Thank you. Yes. So first of all, I want to. So you said there were basically 2 points. I'll deal with the first one, the second one first. So that was the social norms sometimes change without anybody wanting them to, and I think that's actually quite general point. Social norms change; they change enormously. What we don't really know is how to make them change in particular directions. And I mean, sometimes they change in ways we like, and sometimes they change in ways we don't like. But I'm focused on attempts to change them, and that brings me to your first question. And so I've struggled a bit myself. So about the question of power in this kind of project, it is extremely top down here. And my answer to your question is twofold. First of all, because I came to this from a context where when I was writing for the World Bank and going through all of this literature about human misery, right? And where people were kept in that human misery because they were under pressure from social norms. So I came to it with from the background of there are some norms that are just really, really bad for a lot of people, and we need to be able to do something about them. But even those norms have winners and losers when you change it, right? So take an example of all of the work that's going on in changing the social norms about female genital cutting. When you start changing, so I write about that in the chapter about symbolic meaning and all the various ways in which people are trying to reframe what it means to not cut a girl. I mean, there were terms that are so derogatory for an uncut girl that they needed to change the words because it was impossible to talk about it in a non-derogatory way, right? So the idea there is, of course, you want to change the social norms and you want to change the social meaning of what it means to not cut a girl's genitals off. But that, of course, and that's a wonderful goal, right? I think everybody's behind that in this room, obviously. But that also means, of course, that we're changing the symbolic meaning of what it means to have done that procedure to your child and what it means for those children to grow up. Suddenly they are not, the pure ones. Suddenly they are the mutilated ones, right? So I think that in every time we change this, there will be winners and losers. And I have quite an extensive discussion in one of the chapters at the end about the ethics of using social norms or sort of using social norms in this kind of social engineering way. And one of the major questions I'm talking about is justice and how we address the winners and losers kind of situation. But to be fair, that's not just a matter of social norms. It's the same with any laws. So it's the same. It's true of also the social norm that we have, right? So the social norm that they have at the moment is also creating winners and losers. In many ways, all the girls that are about to be cut are losers with the current system. So I think this is an important question, and I discuss it quite extensively in the book. I also want to talk a bit about the top-down perspective, which is completely correct. I use the top-down because I think of this as a democratic question. We think of ourselves as sort of collectively that's part of our collective self-determination, that we have control of the laws under which we live. But we have a whole lot of social norms that we do not have kind of democratic control over. And most of that time, that doesn't matter. Right? But there are times when it does matter, and I do want to put it under democratic control. And I want us to be able to collectively to do something about them if we judge that these things are really, really bad for us, or for a majority, or for a particular vulnerable group, or whatever it is, right? But I also talk in the book, particularly chapter 1, that I see this as a I have a dual target for the book. Yeah, so one target is obviously policymakers, but another target is all the people who might be the target of the measures, of the strategies that the policymakers decide on. Because you also, if you can identify what's going on, what all of these different types of strategies, many of which are already happening, what the effects of those are on social norms, then that also arms you with the tools you need for identifying, first of all, naming what's going on and identifying some of the consequences that's going to have for you. And that is necessary in order for you to mobilize in that democratic discussion and say, look, I don't like this. Right? But in order to be able to say that, you also need to be able to see what's going on and understand the consequences of some of these measures that we have. So that's the way I think of that. So I have a dual target, even though the main emphasis is on the top-down.
Right, thanks. So just to clarify, Per, you also were on the list. Was this your question? Or yeah, okay. So we have four more people on the list. If there is anyone else who wants to be on the list, please make yourself known now. But we have 20 minutes, a little bit less than 20 minutes left for the seminar. So I just want to remind you to not waste the time too much. So Valdemar first.
Thank you, Valdemar Ingdahl here at the Institute. A very inspiring talk and also inspiring many questions. But I think one could be quite interesting to learn from, in conflict with, or even seeing advantages, or what can be taken forward. Namely, you speak about social norms, their stickiness, the difficulty to change them, need for systematic overview. But in the latest year, most of this discussion has been held in the field of behavioral economics, with Nobel Prize winners like Cass Sunstein and Dan Kahneman, just to name a few names. And I'm making a simplification just for the sake of argument, namely that they aren't so sticky. They aren't that difficult to change, because with knowledge from neuroscience, from neurology, you're able to nudge people to even do major nudges and sort of hack the social norms and able to change them. And there has been a lot of discussions about this in the latest years, also with talks. Is this really true? Is there a support for this in the experiments these scientists have done? And I would like you to see, first of all, to hear a comment, how it relates to your work about social norms, but also what you find bad in this, what you can use as an advantage.
Thank you. Yes. I'm not sure what you're supposed to do with it. I've read, so I completely agree with you. There's a whole lot of really interesting stuff coming out of behavioral economics. I've read a lot of that behavioral economics in order to feed into the details of into the the details of the different parts. For example, about the legitimacy of sanctioning. What kind of sanctioning by whom is the most effective when you look at how different groups are managing public goods or collective action or whatever. Right? There's so much. And the way Cass Sunstein, for example, is describing social norms, he talks about this as you know then, social nudging. So he thinks of these as a particular kind of nudge, the social nudge. I discuss that in the book. For the practical purposes of the book, it doesn't really matter if we're supposed to see this as a nudge or something else, because the actual strategies that he's talking about is a lot about the same that I'm talking about here. So whether people want to call it a social nudge or not a social nudge, this is more in the field of how do we define it. But what they talk, so what they when they talk about nudging, I mean, I don't remember each details of the Kassanstein's papers and the book that he's written on this now. So you could correct me if I miss out something really important. But a lot of what he's talking about in that has to do with things that I've talked about today. So changing people's perceptions about what most people do, and changing people's perceptions of approval, and changing who will be able to observe what type of behavior. So those are nudging things in the sense that we're no policymakers telling you what to do. Like, here's a law, here's a rule that you need to obey. What they are doing is they're kind of pushing you in various ways. They're setting up your decision structure in such a way that you will be, drawn towards a particular decision rather than another decision. It's the same with, the nudging literature fits into in so many different respects. Take the case of changing the symbolic meaning. A typical case discussed both by me in this context and in nudging literature is organ donation, when you change the default option from an opting in to an opting out system of donating your organs. So in an opting in, you get the choice of saying, yes, I do want to join the organ donation register. In an opting out system, you get to say, the default is you're in there, but you can say, I want to be left out of the organ donation registry. And that changes the symbolic meaning of this, of the various choices, and that affects people's behavior. So this is a typical nudge, but it's a typical nudge that is exactly what I'm using in the changing the symbolic meaning chapter. But I'm not sure whether all of the things that I'm talking about are what's normally considered nudges, and I don't really want to commit to one way or the other. I would be perfectly happy if people were to say, look, Lina, I want to call this the social nudging, the using social nudges, or changing people's behavior through social nudges. And I think I could say exactly the same thing by just framing it that way. But I chose not to, because when I read the literature about social nudging, the things they're talking about for the social norms there are quite different from the kind of the other types of nudges. They're like the traditional type of nudges. So I just call it the social norm stuff, because that's what, when you're not in the nudges literature, the same kind of thing is talked about in other fields, and they don't use the nudges way of framing it, so to speak.
Thank you. I'm afraid I have to say that I need to interrupt the discussion here. It's time to finish the seminar. Apparently this topic is one worthy of a longer discussion, and we will hope that we will come back to this topic and perhaps invite you again. Thank you so much, Lina, for being here with us today. I will end by just reminding you of the coming seminars in October. We have October 9th, we have Bashir from Israel speaking on egalitarian binationalism for Israel-Palestine, a very topical issue. On October 16th, we have our own Katharina Berndt Rasmussen speaking on Bridging Gaps, a Theory of Discrimination. On October 23rd, we have Christian Rosbel from the University of Copenhagen speaking on why struggles for recognition can harm democracy. Welcome to these other seminars, and thank you again, Lina, for coming here today.